Hello and welcome to episode 9 of A is for Architecture, with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today with the architect, urban designer and activist Robert Adam, whose body of work focuses on vernacular and classical styles and methods. We talk about this, and the role of tradition and authentic voice in our hybrid age.
But architects do things that are out there in the community. So whose traditions are important? Are they your architectural traditions? So if you want to win an award for a building, make sure it's A, got a flat roof, and B, got glass walls. And if it's a house, make sure it looks like the Barcelona Pavilion, because you'll almost certainly get an award. Because the architectural community recognises this. They say, this is one of ours. So it's part of our traditions we give an award. So is that important? Or are the traditions of the population into which they're putting it important? Well, I think the answer is obvious, actually.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to A is for Architecture. I'm here with Robert Adam. Robert, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Robert Adam. I'm an architect, urban designer, sometime author, a regular lecturer. I'm professor of urban design at the University of Strathclyde and have a doctorate from Oxford Brookes. I have been in practice since about 1975, 1976, I suppose, and effectively created my own firm, which I have now sold my shares of and practice on my own. So I'm still active and still in practice and still writing.
Wonderful. Where did you train?
I trained at what was then the Regent Street Polytechnic. It was originally the Polytechnic because there weren't any others. And Regent Street was one of the three major London schools at that time. Now University of Westminster.
I see. And who headed it? Was there a classical tradition?
Not at all. There was absolutely nothing like that at that time whatsoever. I came in, I think it was 1966, and you have to realise that by about 67, 68, it was revolution time, and students were occupying the premises. They were threatening staff, and so on and so on. But what was pretty general by that time is that modernism, as a type or as what one taught and how it was taught, was not only universal but was thought to be the natural order of things. There was no, that time, late 60s, early 70s, there was really no hint at all that it was going to be anything different. There was a slight hint in Venturi's work, Bob Venturi, Complexity and Contradiction Architecture. And if you wanted to appear to be, really up there, when you were carrying your pile of books around, you made sure that there was a copy of Complexity and Contradiction Architecture. But at that time, and I think they were draft dodgers, actually, don't forget this is the time of Vietnam, well, a number of American tutors who were very dismissive of Venturi, saying he was just an Italian-American who'd been to Rome and was showing off. So there was no inkling whatsoever of traditional architecture or classical architecture at all.
That's quite interesting. So it's something that you mention in your book as well. You speak quite, I think, very beautifully. So the book that you have written recently, which was published in 2020, Time for Architecture on Modernity, Memory and Time in Modern Architecture, which is a really interesting kind of study about some of these kinds of issues. And you mention this characteristic of modernism as being a moment of erasure of the past, but laying claim, I suppose, to a number of the ideas of classicism at the same time. So classicism is inbuilt within the modernist tradition. Did you find that, and was that your starting point for your journey away from, I suppose, the agenda of your school towards classical?
Not really. There was the idea at that time that all you needed to do was to come up with the brief and the answer to the brief of the program, and somehow the design would just sort of pop out, and that was all you needed to do. And it was about you had to follow the function of the building and so on and so on. And eventually, the form would dictate. This is clearly nonsense. No, it was no, it was. I have to say, it was probably just, well, two things. One is most at that time, if you went to an architecture school, generally you came straight from school, and you were basically brainwashed. You were told that this was. They used the word you were a heavy minority. So the idea that people didn't like what you were doing was completely irrelevant because you knew best.
Yeah.
And you were taught this, and you were taught you were a superior group. It's cult behavior, really. You learned how to recognize other people in your cult. You were told that you had a secret other people didn't have, and it was their fault they didn't have it, and it was your job then to put it over. But however, I didn't go straight from school. I lived in London for a year before that, and I was living with what I would call normal middle class people, I suppose, trainee lawyers, accountants, and so on. And I shared a house with them, and they saw what I was doing and thought it was completely nuts. And I thought, well, actually, maybe it is. Maybe this is something one should question. So I just questioned it, and I questioned it towards things that were more familiar, I suppose, and which I thought people might like. And I came up against huge resistance. I mean, my first 3 years, actually, it was the way it was structured. It wasn't too bad. I had some very good tutors, actually. Hans Henlein and Mike Foster were quite supportive, although I was only experimenting a tiny bit then. But in the last 2 years, when there were these, my tutor was Rick Mather, actually, who was a rabid Corbusian. And as far as he was concerned, if Corbusier did it, it was all right. And if anyone else did anything else, it wasn't. But he came from the American teaching tradition, really, which was that your professor told you the way it was, and that's what you did. I came from a family background, I suppose, but also the British tradition, I think, is that everything is up for debate and everything is up for argument.
Yes.
And so I just debated, and he got really irritated, actually, got really annoyed. And because as far as he was concerned, he was going to tell me and I was going to do it. That was his job. But this is the last 2 years, he was post-degree, and this is, I saw this as a fantastic opportunity to experiment and try different things. But we were basically told, no, don't do that. You do what we say. And of course, this is post-68. So actually staff were slightly frightened of students. So there's a very sort of complicated issue going on at the time. But I sacked him as a tutor. I mean, he actually appeared at one of my crits and said, I told Robert to do something different and he didn't do it. So I didn't really care. So I rang him up and said, you're not my tutor anymore. I took on another one who said to me, interestingly, a nice man, since died, and he said, I don't like what you do, but you're the only person doing it, and I think it's important. That kind of nearly got me. They tried to fail me, and I was because I had to say my traditional work really wasn't very good because there had absolutely no support. There was no background to it. Mm-hmm. It was broadly traditional. I did experiment with, I got on quite well to start off with on the form follows function thing, because I actually took a brief and I produced 6 different ways of interpreting that with 6 different visual outcomes, just to say, no, there is no absolute. That went quite well. And then I said, well, there's another one, which is doing it traditionally. And that didn't go well at all. No. And Robert Payne, who was the head of Canterbury at the time, my external examiner, forced them to pass me, literally forced them to pass me. I knew I had what happened afterwards. He managed to get me a Rome scholarship. So total transformation. I mean, from being nearly failed to entering this very important international institution.
And in Rome, you sort of encountered the classical tradition in its original state, I suppose, almost like a grand tour. And
well, sort of. My original studies in urbanism actually was the transformation of the imperial city to medieval city.
I see.
But what I'd written actually was my thesis, for which I got the Bannister Fletcher Prize, was on the role of randomness and chance, and the idea that the chaos of the Dark Ages turned it. So anyway, that was my subject. But of course, I saw classicism in its raw form, and also saw it as also because I had a lot of interest in the Dark Ages and the 8th and 9th century. I also saw how it was reinterpreted or taken on, how it evolved from what we call Augustan architecture, which is the thing we're really interested in, it seems, but actually transformed itself dramatically during the Roman Empire, and then on into what we call the Dark Ages, and on into the Romanesque. These people all believed that they were actually producing Roman architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So that also gave me a very particular evolutionary view of classicism, not as some fixed thing done by, taken from Palladio or taken from Brunelleschi or my namesake or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Or that actually it's a much more complex problem, which is still an issue. Actually, I still have this issue with fellow classicists who see it in purist terms, and I really don't.
Yes, my interest in Gothic architecture has that about it as well, where you're ascribing to an entire epoch which lasted nearly 1,000 years, 500 years, a single name and therefore a single identity. And in fact, it of course is transformative. And if you actually stop and look for a second at, say, for example, a Gothic cathedral, you realize that there's 500 years of building right in front of you, and still going. I was at Canterbury Cathedral recently, and they're still doing it. Actually, the building transforms and changes. But it was a point that you made in your book that I want to come back to, that you touched on at the beginning, that I think is incredibly important to the description of the contemporary use of classical forms in architecture and classical aesthetics, which is this idea of a story of progress in architecture. And you mention how this idea of a kind of linear story that's traceable is really false. It's sort of I think you say it's a 19th century, 18th, 19th century invention, a sort of modernist, essentially, invention of linearity in the face of, in opposition to a kind of more synthetic, I suppose, idea.
Well, I think the idea. Well, it's a Marxist idea, really, and it was an Enlightenment idea that there was a thing called progress, and you kind of move forward. And because the Marxist one was, which was that it was going in a particular direction, and that direction was inevitable. It was unavoidable. That's where you were going, and that was called progress. And it's that idea is still out there. The idea. It was an interesting historical idea, and I think this is a historical theory, which is essentially false. I mean, you can demonstrate it's false because it's, I'll go into that in a minute. Is that if you study history, and one of the things you very generally concentrate is the difference between different periods. So you say Gothic, we identify it's got pointed arches, therefore it's different. I don't think they saw it that way, but that's not a matter. And then so you concentrate on differences, and so you begin to believe that the thing that defines your period, the only key authentic thing that defines your period, is its difference from the previous periods. Mm-hmm. So if you believe that is the only true representation of your time, therefore to be of your time you have to be different. And this becomes a sort of treadmill you go on. You say, I've got to keep being different, or I'm not authentic. I'm not of my time. And it's an historical theory. It's very prevalent. I mean, people tell me I'm not of my time, and of course I'm talking to you now. and I say I'm not a ghost. No, I'm not. I am the real thing. And I actually do stuff, and people ask me to do stuff, and therefore I do stuff. So that idea is actually the core idea of modernism. It's part of the Enlightenment. It's and it's a kind of Marxist theory as well. It all rolled together. So you as an historical theory. But the truth is that one of the early essays I wrote was the issue of revival. Is that revivals are constantly taking place. You're constantly back referring, because the past is all you've got. You haven't got anything else. And one of my favorite things I use in my lectures is illustrations of people predicting the future, and how absolutely wrong they almost always are. And they're always recognizable at the time that the vision of the future was produced, because those visions of the future belong to the present in which they were produced.
Yes.
And the other thing is that we're also always back referring. We're always seeking some sort of justification in history. Nicholas Pevsner did it with pioneers which I think was called Pioneers of Modernism, and then it became Pioneers of Modern Design. They were actually seeking, so we must have a history. So we've got to find ourselves a history. And the favorite one is Voisey, who everyone said, oh, well, we're clearly like Voisey, only with flat roofs, because he did horizontal windows. And they actually came to us in the 30s at the time. Voisey was really quite annoyed by it. In quite a humorous way, he wrote this letter saying, well, I did think of suing you all for libel, but I really can't be bothered. This is complete nonsense. But still, to this day, this idea that Voisey is some sort of proto-modernist. Voisey could think of nothing that interested him less. So the idea that just, we all live with the past because there isn't anything else.
Yeah,
there's the present, which is this infinitesimal moment, and we have to use the past to project ourselves in the future.
Yes, and you make this. You quote Saint Augustine on this, about how all we ever do is see either the future, the past, or the present from the present, and everything therefore is interpreted in that way. And I suppose that's what. And then your very funny examples. I mean, that this issue of sci-fi, for example, sci-fi and contemporary architecture, which I always think makes architecture look very dated when it tries to adopt the sci-fi, because it's another point you make in your book about the time it takes to make architecture means that the cultural epoch is very often over by the time the building actually gets built. So you end up getting dated looking sci-fi buildings, which are based around science fiction from 10 years previously, if not more, because the architect is inspired and learns their craft and develops their kind of design philosophy in their early 20s. And it's only when they're 50 that they actually get the opportunity to realize this thing. So you get Zaha Hadid. I mean, Zaha Hadid is essentially doing punk music. It's essentially the Sex Pistols. But it's 30 years before she gets to build it, and by which time, I don't know if it's that relevant anymore.
But I think the science fiction one is interesting because science fiction is now a literary genre, a recognized literary genre.
Yes.
But this was an interesting thing that came up, because I decided, obviously I was dealing with time, I have to decide how people thought about the future, and science fiction is a very good model. The more I looked into it, the more interesting it was, because if a rough history, I mean, people say it's started with Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, but that's really a Gothic novel with electricity. It's really started with Jules Verne and the Time Machine and H.G. Wells, and that was kind of steampunk. It was kind of technology based, and they criticized one another for getting their science wrong and so on. And then in the interwar period, it became a sort of pulp fiction genre in the United States. I mean, it was a comic thing, and these books, novels were produced called pulp fiction because of the lousy paper they printed it on. And they invented the word science fiction actually in the 1930s. And then after the Second World War, it became a literary genre and became very well established and so on and so on. And people started to study it. One of the key people studied was a man called Suvin. And they tried to define what it was that made science fiction. It was very interesting. It was two things. It was the novum, they called it, the new thing, and disjunction, which came from Brechtian theatre theory, and modernist theatre. Very interesting. But if you actually put that alongside modernism, it has a very similar trajectory. You get this sort of early interest in technology, late 19th, early 20th century. It then becomes a minority activity in the 1920s and 30s, and then becomes an established genre in the post-war. You can't pursue it too much further than that. But it's very interesting. That idea, the novum, the entirely new thing, and disjunction, both exist in modernism. Is you've got to produce something new, and it's got to be different from the past. So that still exists. But the key thing about it, the novum, is it only lasts for a short period of time and very, very quickly becomes familiar. So the idea that you've got to shock and produce something completely different is an infant. And even if I like your point, is is actually it's what you learned when you were in your 20s and your 50s. You're still doing it. It's stale already, but it's going to be stale anyway. Even 20 years after you've done it, because it's just become familiar. So it's a false objective, really.
Yes, and furthermore, I think the way that architecture works as a professional culture, as an enterprise, is that which is avant-garde is, and this is a point made by the architectural writer Dana Cuff, the discrepant, as she calls it, the discrepant practices is enfolded back into the center, and the discrepancy, this avant-gardeness, this critical quality, is actually permitted by the cultural center. So even when it's being naughty, it's actually performing the role that the center, the mainstream, wants it to perform, which is, and that mainstream obviously now is a kind of generic commercial modernism. But I wanted to talk more about this idea of time and authenticity. So neoclassicism presents a lot of issues for the architecture student, for the architectural connoisseur, because it seems to be of a time past, and it seems to be something to do with it has become politically, at least for the architectural kind of discourse, become politically associated with certain movements, and has had its name sullied in that way. But I just wanted to ask you about this issue of authenticity and whether there is an inherent authentic architecture and how classical architecture, traditional architecture relates to that. Is there some kind of true architecture that transforms over time that neoclassicism therefore is kind of subverting or ignoring or doing something wrong?
Well, no. I think the issue of authenticity is it's a chimera. I mean, how can something be inauthentic if you're doing it? It's just not possible. My favorite one is the rebuilding of war, because in conservation this is a big issue actually. Mm-hmm. All the UNESCO charters and things about being authentic, the NARA Charter for Authenticity. Mm-hmm. They really, rack themselves up with this. And it's also part of that basic modernist theory, is that every period is different, therefore you've got to keep that difference. And actually, the curious thing about it is that there is a sort of conspiracy, if you like, with that view of history and conservation, is you've got to keep past authenticity to show that what you're doing is different and therefore authentic. Mm. My favorite example is the rebuilding of Warsaw, because the center of Warsaw was destroyed systematically before the Germans left. And as it happens, the School of Architecture had kept, actually been, in the 1930s, had been recording it very accurately. And they actually buried their records, and they dug them up again. And based on photographs and based on these drawings, they rebuilt the center of Warsaw, to which this day is a tourist attraction. But of course, it's not authentic because it's all reconstruction. Mm. And it looks like it is. And a lot of people go there won't realize actually that what they're looking at is almost all the 1940s, 50s reconstruction. So is this authentic? Well, ironically, UNESCO actually made it a World Heritage Site, and they're very worried about authenticity. As they said, it's a very good example of post-war reconstruction. So it's authentically inauthentic. Yeah. You're kind of locked into this sort of bizarre idea that you can be authentically inauthentic. And of course, when you look at things in the past, this was really not of anybody. People really weren't concerned about this. You stuck noses back on statues, because obviously they originally had noses, and of course now you take them off because that's not authentic. But it is authentic because they put it on in the 18th century. So that's authentically inauthentic. And so you get locked into this sort of mad thing that you can actually, it's actually possible not to be authentic and do something now. Yeah. It's a complete chimera. And do you think it's used as a way of kind of in a way of kind of retaining a prestige to modernism, elevating its
its value, its cultural value above neoclassicism by saying, well, we're authentic and neoclassicism is inauthentic. And if you want something that's culturally valuable, authenticity is a value that we have.
It's part of that history theory. I mean, you say that it's not authentic because people were doing it in the past. Well, of course, my favorite other one is Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, which of course is completely inauthentic. It's a facsimile. People go there and worship it as Mies van der Rohe, but actually it's a facsimile.
Well, I mean, it's entirely accepted within art, isn't it? Already, Carl Andre's equivalentate, that stack of bricks, is not the same stack of bricks. In fact, they don't ship those bricks around the world when they want to recreate Carl Andre's equivalentate. They simply get some bricks and put it in the shape of... So there's some idea at the heart of the artwork that the idea supersedes and transcends.
The physical fabric.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. We have this debate. There is this common debate in the people who practice classical architecture. It's what I call the sash window debate. Is that, you've got to put sash windows in or it's not an authentic classical building. This is nonsense, of course, because they only have them in Holland, United States, Portugal, and other places. Other classical buildings don't. So why is this authentic? And a lot of people actually believe that it is. I have this debate all the time. So equally well that when you produce a classical building, it has to be period specific, so you can't mix things up. You can't, but because you get in a real problem there, because how do you mix up central heating and something which did where central heating wasn't invented, and so on and so on. So that debate actually exists within those who produce classical architectures. They believe that the way you test the authenticity of something is that it actually is authentic to a particular period, and I call that a reproduction. That's just a reproduction is authentic, because I know my authenticity. But I have that, as I said at the beginning, I have this more evolutionary view, is that it's there to be developed. But I think, of course, the argument you come up with then is, well, if you can change it so much, how can you tell that the person is literate? What makes a good classical building, what doesn't? And the answer which I've evolved over time on this one is that if you're fluent in language, and we're speaking English and we're fluent in English, if you hear somebody else speaking that language and they're speaking in a strange way, pretty much if they're doing that because they've been creative with the language or because they can't speak it properly. And that's the closest I can get to it. In the sort of postmodern period, I remember working with somebody in Terry Fowler's office who was drawing upside down balusters, and he was very pleased with himself. And I said, "These are upside down." He said, "Yes, that's because I'm being original." Well, I said, "They did that actually in the 17th century," and he was very disappointed. The idea that debate rages as well, and actually is quite common in the traditional architecture, classical architecture field. And I'm something of an outrider on that one.
Yes. So this idea of, you do get even that discussion around authenticity in the work of people like Michael Hopkins, isn't it? Where there's this idea of material having integrity to the materials, and that you've got to therefore, if you're going to build a building that looks like it's made of brick, it actually has to be made of load-bearing brick, and having a steel frame and a brick skin on the outside is somehow, again, inauthentic, and therefore does something, it's sort of immoral. There's a moral content to this discussion, which I've always found very interesting.
It's also shared by people like Quinlan Terry. He believes the same thing. And there is what I call constructional fundamentalism, which straddles traditional architecture and modernism. Is that, in fact, the fact that Romans put thin bits of marble onto brick buildings made it look like marble, that seems to have been forgotten somewhere in this process. Dimitri Porphyrios comes up with this, as indeed does Leo Krier. But we know very well that these people, in the end, particularly Dimitri Porphyrios, produces steel frame buildings that he clads in brick. One might be realistic about this, but there is that idea that I say constructional fundamentalism, and it's something that modernists, and in fact, actually, interestingly, I remember I did a talk on an office building I did in Piccadilly, which is basically got stone, but it's stone attached to concrete and so on. To an organisation that deals with offices, and all the architects there were, routine modernists, and they were happier with Quinlan Terry's view that it had to be load-bearing brickwork than they were with my view. Is that actually this is an expression you can do in whatever way you like, whatever it may be. They were more comfortable because that kept they shared the construction fundamentalism, and B, it kept a distance. I was invading their territory by saying, actually, these are big precast panels that are covered in stone and so on and so on, because it kind of pulled the rug out from their argument that, authenticity meant you had to design in this particular way. If they say, well, actually, classical architecture is the same thing, but of course they're out of date and they're impractical. They end up with 2-foot thick walls at the bottom and so on and so on. So we're doing the thing now. So they were uncomfortable because I was straying into their territory. They're quite happy when you're out there, producing reproductions. But the minute you steal into, it takes away their argument that this is the way you have to do it.
Yes. I mean, there is something also about the whole debate about material integrity, which is to do with cost, in that having integrity to material, I mean, steel frame building, modernism as a whole is a very cheap form of architecture and is reflective of, I suppose, the spread of architecture into everyday life, its role, its increasing impact as a discipline on things. It I suppose in response to population growth and the requirement for ubiquitous high standards of living and things like that. Modernism is cheap as chips, whereas material integrity, if you're going to build a stone building to look like a stone building, to actually be a stone building, you've got to pay some serious money. I was looking at the stonemasonry work of a chap you might know of called Andre Vrona, who's based, who does a lot of Quinlan Terry's monumental masonry. He's based.
I know exactly. Yeah, he's quite a purist, actually. Yeah.
And his work, I mean, it's extraordinary level of stuff. I mean, look at his Instagram account. The sizes of the stuff he's doing is pure stone as well. And you think, well, that is only amenable really to a very, very elite set of people.
Yes, I have a particular view about this. The interesting thing is this same office building that I produced. There is a square meter price guide for producing buildings in different locations. Mm-hmm. And this building, which is a classical building, was precisely within that price guide. And Allies and Morrison produced a scheme for the same site, and their scheme came up within that price guide too. So actually, there wasn't any great difference in price at all. And I think what the interesting thing is, it's rather like there was a moment, when, in the 20s and 30s when actually producing a stripped down building kind of blew the idea that you had to apply decoration. It wasn't a proper building. And then once it went down that route, you can never quite recover because it could still be great architecture, but actually it was stripped down, therefore was very cheap. But at the same time, the thing about traditional design, and let's use the example of classical design, is it's just about as much as what you take off as what you put on. You if you're actually designing a building, you don't cover it with columns. You don't, there isn't a Corinthian capital everywhere. You can actually have virtually none of that. I mean, a lot of Georgian houses have none of that. But what they have is, you can actually strip it off, or you can add it back on again. You can add it or subtract it. And when I talk to my clients, I say, basically, I'm designing a building for you, and I can turn the volume up or down. I can turn the volume up, and I can give you loads and loads of decoration if that's what you want, or I can turn it right down and have practically none. And of course, a lot of 30s buildings were like that, actually. And usually the last thing to go was the corners. Particularly Swedish classical building, 1930s, that whole culture of stripping things down was very common at that time. So you can produce very, very cheap buildings in classical design. It just is that you turn the volume down. And of course, you do that in design anyway. So, how do you emphasize the entrance, for example? You emphasize the entrance by turning the volume up on the entrance. That's what you do. You just put more on, you take less off elsewhere. And it's that kind of balancing act. But the point is, because it is inherently familiar, when you take it off, it's implied. You kind of mentally know you can add it on. So if you didn't, I did this in my original book on classical architecture. I took a building and I took a room, and I gradually stripped them down. So basically, they were just openings.
I think this is really, really interesting. There's a couple of obviously, classical architecture traditional architecture gets sort of vilified in the end by this idea of ornamentation being superfluous, and in some way, it's the thing that's not talked about with regards Adolf Loos and his Ornament and Crime, is this idea, in fact, associating ornamentation with primitivism.
It's very racist.
So there is definitely a racialist quality to his.
What Loos said was unbelievable. In fact, now that racism is a significant issue, nobody gives a full quote. Because he was being incredibly racist.
Yes. So, but I think that's really interesting that if for neoclassical or traditional architecture, there's this issue of ornament which constitutes a problem for modernism, and I've never quite worked it out, because for me, architecture's spatial content is part of its ornamentation, and as you say, therefore adding details, figurative details here and there, or symbolic details, doesn't seem to me to be much more. As you say, it's about turning the volume up. But I love this. I love this idea of what classical architecture does is produce familiarity, and that has a natural relationship to the way that people expect architecture to look. So I'm not talking about the Guggenheim clients, the Rockefeller clients. I'm talking about ordinary people who perhaps don't spend that much time thinking about architecture. They see classical buildings as being normative, actually. It's the modernist buildings that are anti-normative.
It's the two strands here, because you produce enough of them, they become normative. But there are two strands here. One of them is ornamentation. Ornament is additional material put onto something for effect. That's what it is in the end. Now, it is no. You can have abstract ornamentation. You can have representational ornamentation. But there is, other than the most elementary shed, all buildings have ornamentation. If you produce a window which has more material on it than it actually absolutely routinely, at its absolute minimal state, has, that's ornamentation. So you're always ornamenting buildings. The completely unornamented building, sheds do exist, and they are unornamented, but actually most architects don't want to do that. They want to add something to that shed, decorated shed, or actually just make it do stuff with it, which is kind of artistic and creative, and that's ornament. In the end, it's ornament. It's all ornament.
But I also like this. Sorry, carry on.
Okay.
No, I was just going to say, I also really like this idea that the absence or the subtraction of ornament constitutes a form of ornamentation insofar as it signifies its own absence. And people know that or intuitively.
Yeah, that's the other. That was the key point in a way. It is that it is expectancy and therefore familiarity, and this takes you to tradition. It's you're operating within your cultural traditions, and those cultural traditions vary. They vary from place to place, and they vary quite widely. But they are there, and that's what we exist in. We all exist in our cultural traditions. Not all of us. We can't avoid it. And very often these things are symbolic. So I think the interesting, in tradition more broadly. There's two aspects of this. One is that we all have them, We'll have them every day. I mean, the language is a traditional medium, and in fact, it can't be understood unless it was traditional. You can't make it up from scratch, because if you don't understand it, there's kind of no point. As a result of that, it contains a richness which it brings in from the past, and it also evolves. So we all have traditions, and traditions have really three sort of broad categories, in my opinion. One is they have to have an ancestry. They don't have to have a real ancestry. They can have a made-up ancestry, but they have to have an ancestry. But making it up has to be convincing. It has to have some kind of historical resonance. It has to be identifiable. I mean, you have to be able to see it. And if you can't, it's actually well, I've said to me, I do tradition too, but it's invisible. I said, well, it's not tradition. You can't see it. It isn't. It's a symbolic activity, and it belongs. It's one of the things by which the community identifies itself. Communities identify themselves by their traditions. I mean, it's very interesting that in immigrant communities everywhere, I mean, is that often language survives less than family ceremonies, weddings, funerals, and all those sorts of things. Now, these things have great symbolic importance, and they identify the community from which the person comes. And you can go to Christian communities, or Jewish communities, or Hindu communities, or Muslim communities, and they identify themselves by a series of traditions. So we all have them. They're all there, but they have to have ancestry. And of course, the interesting thing is, as I said earlier, is that modernism is very anxious to discover its ancestry. And to present its ancestry. I mean, Zaha Hadid, with Malevich, she thought that Malevich's work had not really been fully developed, and she, in her early career, was saying that's what I'm doing. All sort of modernist theories don't say, well, I'm starting completely from scratch. They locate themselves in often slightly mythical past, and so let's say traditions are universal. So whose traditions? If you're doing a building for people, I mean, if you're not doing it for other architects, most architects do things for other architects. Most people are interested in their peer group rather than anybody else. That's the way it is. But architects do things that are out there in the community. So whose traditions are important? Are they your architectural traditions? So if you want to win an award for a building, make sure it's A, got a flat roof, and B, got glass walls. And if it's a house, make sure it looks like the Barcelona Pavilion, because you'll almost certainly get an award, because they get rolled out all the time for those. Because the architectural community recognizes this. They said, this is one of ours. So it's part of our traditions, we give it an award. So is that important? Because it's important to architects. Or are the traditions of the population into which they're putting it important? Well, I think the answer is obvious, actually. But I think that most professional groups are really interested in their peer group. But architects should be interested in the traditions of everybody else, the other 99.9% of the population. They're going to have something to do with it. And this goes back to what's currently emerging in British planning and the National Model Design Code. That's what it's trying to say at the moment. So once you've established that everybody has traditions, which I think is the important thing, and I think any sociologist will tell you that. Is that the issue is whose traditions are appropriate, and that becomes a good, sensible, moral judgment without getting involved in whether it's got Corinthian columns on it or not.
Yeah, so I don't want to. I know I haven't got you for much longer, and there's two further questions I want to ask. I suppose one is the role of tradition in a, say, multicultural or hybrid society. So how, if we're talking about representation of traditions, and classicism does a good job of representing a certain strand of tradition within, say, for example, the British or Western European culture, but you're dealing in a community that has not got that cultural heritage, ethnic heritage, whatever it is, then what is the relevance of this, or how does the classical architect? Yeah, that's a better question. How does a classical architect operate in the context of demographic diversity?
It's interesting. I mean, the example I'm doing houses in India at the moment, and I mean, India is very interesting because actually, what Britain did in the 19th century has become part of its own tradition in an interesting way. and hybridity is normal. I mean, classical architecture had its own hybridity and will continue to do so. I mean, interesting that one house I did is actually a deliberate hybrid between Mughal architecture and European classical architecture. It was a definite relationship. I mean, it's a very clear relationship. But interestingly, my favorite example of this is Kerala in southwest India, which has a Christian population going back to the 2nd century. It's not Britain introduced. About 30% of the population are Christian. But when the Raj was established, we built Gothic revival churches. And so somewhere along the line, the Kerala Christians decided that this Gothic revival, nothing to do with them, was a Christian type. And so they've now taken it on, and it's still producing these Kerala hybrid buildings, and it's their own style. So it's an interesting issue. I worked in Beirut, and most people go to Beirut, Muslim architecture, looking at and doing architecture, looking at an airplane window, saying, they got these pointed arches, therefore if I stick those on my glass wall building, that'll make it local. But working with a Lebanese architect, I realized there's a lot of subtlety, a lot of things that one really wouldn't understand. So, as I say, I think, and this is why I'd rather say traditional rather than classical. Classical is all classical architecture is traditional, but not all traditional architecture is classical. And that's why I also want to go through the evolutionary process, where there is no real purity in this. There is only literacy. There's only understanding and literacy. So it's not an issue. Although I have to say, the house I'm doing at the moment in Ahmedabad, they specifically wanted a British or European classical building. And I said, don't you want a Gujarati type? And he said, no, I didn't. And all the Indian architects who I'm, discussing it with, they're quite uneasy about this, but that's what my client wants. So that's what we're going to produce. So as I say, once you have an evolutionary aspect to this, and once you don't have this purist side, it's not difficult because all you're doing is you're just bringing in other traditions as necessary.
Yes. Well, that's really, really interesting. I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I wanted to ask one final question about the process of designing in the classical tradition. And I think for people, there's an assumption, for example, that hand drawing plays a greater role in the classical design or traditional design model. And therefore, if you're no good at hand drawing, which I don't believe anybody is no good, they just haven't practiced enough, then you can't be you can't do traditional design, and the computer and modernism go hand in hand, or the computer and contemporary architecture. So I kind of wanted to understand how you go about designing things, and then also the way that you conceive of the making process as well. Now, if you were a purist, a constructional fundamentalist, as you call them, there would be something specific, I guess, about that. But your hybrid or your synthetic approach must mean that you have a kind of, I suppose, synthetic approach to the technologies of architectural design as well.
In designing buildings, this is rather trite, I suppose, but obviously the plan is the really important thing. If the plan doesn't work, forget it. And of course, you can structure your plan in certain ways. And I produce very asymmetrical buildings. I produce very symmetrical buildings. All of these things can be done. If the client wants a very symmetrical building, you can do it. If the plan doesn't work, nothing works. So that's fundamental. We all share that. The interesting thing is sheer constructional ignorance in the architectural profession. It is really, really frightening. I work. A very good example, actually. It wasn't a lecture I was giving, but one of my colleagues was giving, where the architect in this particular case didn't like the idea that sills projected in front of the thing, because he wanted an absolutely sheer front to the building. So when you got the sills of the windows, he had this brilliant idea, which he said Eric Parry invented. I must speak to Eric about this sometime, where actually the water falls back towards the window. You think, hang on. And then you put a little gutter in front of the window with little drain pipes that go out. And you think, am I in a madhouse? But But actually, this is serious stuff. I felt like saying to the guy, I do suggest you check your liability insurance, because this is going to fail.
Yeah.
And actually, in the end, you just make buildings that work and stand up. And if you've got to add stuff to them, you add stuff to them. And if you've got decoration, you add decoration. But the thing about architects is that we concentrate on our differences hugely. But actually 99% or 95% of what we do is exactly the same. We all have clients that don't pay. We all have contractors who don't produce things on time. But we really should understand. I was talking to a member of staff with I'm working about details he was producing. I said, well, just start off with how it's made, then take it from there. Don't make it into some abstract essay in something. Start off with how it's made. Buildings have to have damp-proof causes. You have to carry the water off buildings. That is absolutely number one. If he doesn't do that, so this sill detail was completely bonkers.
Yeah.
And for the sake of not having things projecting, you mean you didn't have the ability or imagination to design a good building that kept water out of it? I mean, come on. It's not surprising architects get a bad reputation. It's so. That's what we do, is we make buildings that for people with their plans work and they fit into where they go, and they function and people like them and they can be constructed within a reasonable.
But do you sit down and draw the building by hand, and then and when you sell the building to the client, when you present it, when you do that miraculous thing that architects do, which is persuade people to part with vast sums of money on the promise 5 years down the line of a giant beautiful thing, but all they get is a picture that's this big. Do you present them with hand drawings, and then everything else is done in the contemporary way?
It depends on the client. I mean, one of my favorite things, which I really like to do, is to sit down with the client and a pencil and a piece of paper and design it with them. And I'll work through the plan with them. We'll try out options. I'll sketch little elevations and so on. I mean, it's just a very effective way of doing it, because then the client feels that they partly designed it. And they have. And that's a technique. You have to have certain drawing skills to do that. But in some cases, I don't do that. It depends. It'll come out as a CAD drawing. I mean, CAD is only a means of recording information more or less efficiently. It just is that hand drawing actually at design stage is often very much quicker and more flexible. It just is quicker and more flexible.
Yeah.
I have a story about this, which I'm sorry, I can bang on about this. I belong to a thing called the Architecture Club, and we ran a sort of debate on hand drawing. And also, I mean, my old office, I ran life drawing classes. Actually, drawing is about visual acuity. That's what it is. And anyway, so we ran this debate. It was an interesting debate. Most of the major firms, London firms, were there, and we had three people producing drawings while the debate went on. One of them was George Samrin Smith, who one of his great tricks is there are lots of videos of this they're worth looking at, is producing enormous drawings, in sort of time delay, usually copies of other drawings. And we had Will Alsop with a sort of 4-inch paintbrush and chucking paint at a canvas. And then we had this Chinese guy who was supposed to be the number one virtual presenter in CAD or in computer graphics. And he was producing these amazing floating images on this. This is all taking place. And after a while, first thing was that just about every one of these major offices was running life classes or something like it, because they all recognize the role of drawing and visual acuity. That's all it is. If you draw a face, and it looks really wonky, then you're obviously clearly not looking properly. So, but anyway, after a while, we noticed this guy who was doing this thing, a little book. And we said, what's in the book? Oh, he said, I draw it first.
Say that again.
I draw it first. I do a little sketch before. So obviously not the complete floating thing, but this is very revealing, in fact, because there's something very elementary. It's just a connection between something you're doing down here, you're looking at up there, and so on.
Yeah.
And there's no reason why you can't do that on a screen, but for some reason, and this may pass. For some reason, this direct connection becomes disconnected because it's another digital process taking place. It takes onto a screen, and it has its own disciplines. For example, if I'm doing a housing layout, I'm not moving little rectangles around. I'm actually doing something much more flexible. And of course, people like Zaha Hadid who use parametricism, which is a perfectly legitimate thing, just to produce bizarre shapes. I mean, that's what the parametricism did, and Patrick Schumacher writes about this extensively. But it's just a tool. This is what you want to do. If you don't want to produce that, don't do it. So, as I say, there's no magic about computing. There is a certain amount of magic about hand drawing, just because it tends to be more efficient, and it tends to, when you get to producing technical drawings and when you get to exchanging information, digital information is so much more efficient. I mean, it's just incredibly efficient, and you're not worried really about moving things around a little bit, tying a slight angle here, and so on, which you can do very rapidly in hand drawing. You're not worried about that. You're transferring information efficiently, which is extremely good. So no, in the end, we're all doing the same thing. People are using CAD or not using CAD. I would recommend hand drawing because it's a very effective, and it's bloody brilliant with clients because they actually see the thing forming in front of them with a pencil, and you can actually draw little vignettes. And my God, they like it. It's a really effective selling technique, but it's also a very efficient way of working.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Good. Well, hope somebody else does too. Okay.
I'm sure they will. Okie dokie. That was great. Thank you to Robert for a fine, broad discussion. Please look in the podcast description for links to Robert's practice and writings. Share, like, follow, subscribe, Ears for Architecture. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. Cheers.